Kethra had served in the Valoran military for 30 cycles, and she believed she understood war better than most soldiers in the galaxy. She had fought against the insectoid Charix in the swamps of their homeworld, where the air itself was poison, and every shadow hid 1,000 clicking mandibles, waiting to tear flesh from bone. She had survived the siege of Novalan Prime, where she watched entire cities burn, and friends she had known for decades turn to ash in the nuclear fire. She had stood on the bridge of warships and watched fleets numbering in the thousands exchange fire until the void itself seemed to glow with death. All of this she had learned what fear meant, and she had learned to control it and push it down deep inside, where it could not touch her ability to fight. She was a veteran of 100 battles, and she wore her scars with pride because each one told a story of survival against impossible odds when the Dominion invaded the outer systems and began their slow march toward the core worlds. She felt the familiar cold grip of concern, but not panicked. Dominion were powerful, yes, but they were just another enemy, and enemies could be defeated if you had enough soldiers and enough weapons and enough willingness to sacrifice. That was what Kethra believed until the day the Alliance Council made an announcement that would change everything she thought. She knew the humans had agreed to join the war. Kethra remembered sitting in the briefing room with her fellow officers when Admiral Virus displayed the human biological profiles on the holographic screen. The room had gone silent and then filled with a strange mixture of sounds that in Valoran culture indicated confusion and disbelief. The creatures on the screen looked so impossibly fragile, but Kethra initially thought there had been some mistake in the data transmission. They had no natural armor covering their soft pink or brown skin that looked like it would tear at the slightest touch. They had no venom glands or poison sacs or any chemical defense systems whatsoever. Their bones were made of calcium and would break under pressure that any Valoran child could easily withstand. They could not regenerate lost limbs or organs, and even minor damage to their internal systems could prove fatal. Their eyes could only see a tiny fraction of the light spectrum, and their hearing was so limited that they would be nearly deaf. By Valoran standards, most shocking of all was their lifespan, which averaged only 70 to 80 of their planetary cycles. Kethra had household items older than that a Valoran soldier might serve for 300 cycles before retirement, and in that time they would gain wisdom and experience that made them formidable warriors. These humans would barely have time to learn the basics of combat before their bodies began to fail them. Admiral Virus clicked his mandibles together in the gesture that indicated troubled thoughts as he addressed the assembled officers. "They have volunteered for frontline combat duty," he said, and the room erupted in sounds of disbelief. "Every single human unit that has been offered to the Alliance has requested assignment to active combat zones." Kethra raised her hand and waited for permission to speak. "Admiral, with respect, this must be a translation error, or perhaps a misunderstanding of our military terminology." "I thought the same thing, Commander Kethra," the Admiral replied. "I had our diplomatic corps verify the request 7 times through 7 different translation matrices. The humans know exactly what they are asking for, and they are insistent that they be allowed to fight alongside our forces on the most dangerous fronts." Kethra felt something cold settle in her stomach that she could not quite identify. It was not fear exactly, but rather a deep unease at the thought of these fragile creatures walking willingly into the fire. She had seen many species join the Alliance over her long career, and most of them had the good sense to request support roles or defensive positions where their weaknesses would not be exploited. The Malorians, with their incredible mathematical minds, served as tactical advisors and communications specialists. The Dranathi, whose bodies could not handle rapid acceleration, worked in the shipyards and construction facilities far from the front lines. Even the mighty Cortan warriors, who stood 3 meters tall and could tear through steel with their bare hands, understood the value of positioning themselves where their strength could be maximized. But These humans wanted to stand in the path of the Dominion war machine with nothing but their soft skin and their fragile bones. Cathra decided that it must be ignorance. They were a young species who had only recently discovered faster than light travel, and they simply did not understand what real war looked like. They had probably only ever fought among themselves on their single small planet, and they had no concept of the scale of destruction that awaited them. She felt something close to pity as she received her orders to report to the frozen moon of Araxis 7, where she would command a joint defense force that included one of these human units. The moon was a strategic point that the Dominion would need to capture before advancing further into Alliance territory, and everyone knew that a major assault was coming. Cathra spent the transport journey reviewing everything the Alliance knew about humans, which turned out to be surprisingly little. They came from a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system on the outer edge of the galaxy. They had only achieved spaceflight within the last few of their generations, and they had spread to only a handful of nearby worlds. Their technology was adequate, but nothing special, and they had no unique resources or strategic advantages that explained why the Alliance had accepted them. The only thing that seemed to set them apart was their persistence. The historical records showed that humans had survived multiple extinction-level events on their home world, including ice ages and asteroid impacts and massive volcanic eruptions. They had continued to grow and spread, despite living on a planet that seemed determined to kill them at every opportunity. Cathra found this mildly interesting, but not particularly impressive. Many species had survived difficult conditions on their home worlds, and that did not make them suited for interstellar warfare. When her transport landed on Araxis 7, she stepped out into the bitter cold and looked up at the gray sky and wondered how many of these humans would survive their first real battle. She gave them a week at most before they were begging for evacuation to a safer position. She had no way of knowing that within a few days she would be the one questioning everything she believed about strength and weakness and what it truly meant to be a warrior. The humans were coming, and they would teach her lessons she never expected to learn. The human transport ship arrived 3 days after Cathra established her command post on Araxis 7, and she stood on the landing platform with her senior officers to observe their new allies. The ship itself was enough to make her mandibles click with concern. It was an older model that looked like it had been repaired dozens of times with whatever materials happened to be available, and the hull was scarred with plasma burns and impact damage that spoke of many close calls. Cathra would not have trusted that ship to transport cargo, let alone living soldiers, and she wondered if the humans were too poor to afford better equipment or simply too foolish to demand it. Boarding ramp lowered with a grinding sound that made her wince, and the first human stepped out into the frozen air of the moon. She was smaller than Cathra had expected even after reviewing the biological data, and her skin was a warm brown color that seemed completely wrong against the white and gray landscape. The human wore armor that looked almost comically thin compared to what Valan soldiers wore, and she carried a weapon that Cathra could have snapped in half with one hand. But it was her face that caught Cathra's attention. The human looked up at the assembled Valorn officers and did something with her mouth that Cathra had never seen before. Her lips pulled back to reveal her teeth in what looked like an aggressive display, but her eyes did not match the expression, and her body language remained relaxed and open. Cathra's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm before one of her aides leaned close and whispered an explanation. "It is called a smile, Commander, and it is apparently a gesture of friendship among their kind." Cathra forced herself to relax, but she could not shake the strangeness of a species that showed its teeth to indicate peaceful intentions. The human approached and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong for such a small creature. "Sergeant Chen reporting for duty, Commander, and these are my soldiers ready to fight." Cathra looked past the sergeant at the 11 other humans filing off the transport and felt her concern deepen. They were so varied in appearance that she initially thought they might be different subspecies. Some were tall and some were short, and their skin came in different shades, and their hair grew in different colors and textures. Among the Lorans, there was little physical variation between individuals, but these humans looked like they had been assembled from spare parts. "Welcome to Araxis 7, Sergeant Chen," Cathra said through her translator device. "I hope your journey was not too difficult. We have had worse," Chen replied, and her soldiers made sounds with their mouths that Cathra would later learn was called laughter. The following days before the expected Dominion assault gave Cathra many opportunities to observe the humans, and what she saw disturbed her in ways she could not fully articulate. On the first night, she walked past the human barracks and heard sounds of shouting and physical impact from inside. She rushed in expecting to find her new allies under attack, only to discover 2 of them engaged in what appeared to be genuine combat. They were striking each other with closed fists, and blood was flowing from split lips and cut eyebrows, and neither of them showed any sign of stopping. Cathra shouted for them to cease, and they separated immediately, looking at her with expressions of confusion. "Commander, is something wrong?" Sergeant Chun asked, appearing from a side room. "Your soldiers are fighting each other," Cathra said. "This is a serious breach of military discipline, and I demand an explanation." Chun looked at the 2 bloodied humans and then back at Cathra and made that strange tooth showing expression again. "They are not fighting, Commander. They are training, and it keeps their reflexes sharp and their minds focused. They are injuring each other for practice. Minor injuries heal, and a soldier who's never been hit will freeze the first time they take real damage in combat." Cathra watched the 2 humans bump their fists together in what appeared to be a gesture of mutual respect, despite the blood still dripping from their faces. "You deliberately cause pain to yourselves so that you will be prepared for more pain. That is one way to describe it, yes." This was madness, and Cathra could find no framework in her understanding of military tactics to explain it. Over the following days, she observed many more things that challenged her assumptions about what made sense for a species trying to survive. She watched the human medic Torres work for 19 straight hours, treating wounded Alliance soldiers who had arrived from a nearby skirmish. Humans required regular periods of unconsciousness to function properly, and going without this sleep caused their bodies and minds to deteriorate rapidly. When Torres finally collapsed from exhaustion, his companions simply carried him to a bed, and another human took over his duties without complaint. She learned that humans deliberately consumed a chemical called capsaicin that caused intense burning pain in their mouths because they enjoyed the sensation. She watched them go outside in the freezing temperatures with inadequate protection because they wanted to feel the cold and see the stars. She heard them singing together one night, and the sound was unlike anything she had experienced before. It was a rhythmic, haunting melody that seemed to speak of loss and longing and home, and yet somehow also of hope and determination and the refusal to surrender. When she asked Chun about the song, the sergeant explained that humans had been making music since before they learned to write, and that it helped them process emotions and bond with each other. "You sing about sadness to feel better?" Cathra asked. "We sing about everything, and it reminds us that we are not alone and that others have faced what we face and survived." Cathra thought about this for a long time. On the last night before the Dominion assault, she found herself sitting with Chun in the command center reviewing defensive positions. "Your species," Cathra said carefully, "you are aware of your own mortality, yes, and you know that you will die." Chun's expression shifted in a way Cathra could not read. "Every single day we wake up knowing that it could be our last, and yet you volunteered for this mission and you requested frontline combat duty." "We did. I do not understand how a species that knows it will die can choose to run toward death rather than away from it," Chen was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, because running away does not stop. Death, Commander, and it only delays it, and in the meantime, you have to live with the knowledge that you ran. We would rather die standing than live kneeling, and that is just how we are built. Kethra looked at this small, fragile creature who would probably not survive the coming battle and felt something shift inside her chest. She did not yet have a word for what she was feeling, but it was the first seed of something that would grow into genuine respect. The alert sirens began to wail and both of them rose to their feet. The Dominion had arrived. The Dominion came with overwhelming force, just as Kethra had expected, and within the first hour she understood that the Alliance defenses would not hold enemy. Ships filled the sky like a swarm of metal insects and drop pods rained down across the frozen landscape carrying thousands of Dominion shock troops. The first defensive line collapsed within 30 minutes as Dominion heavy weapons tore through fortifications that had taken weeks to build. Kithra watched from the command center as position after position went dark on the tactical display, and she felt the cold grip of despair tightening around her. The Charik's auxiliaries broke first, and their hive mind became overwhelmed with panic signals that spread through their entire unit like a disease. They abandoned their positions and fled toward the evacuation shuttles, and nothing their officers said could stop them then. The Valoran units began to fall back, and these were soldiers Kethra had served with for decades, who had proven their courage in 100 battles. But courage has limits, and when those limits are reached, even the bravest warriors will retreat. Kethra gathered what remained of her command staff and prepared to order a general evacuation when a transmission came through on her communication. "Array. All units, this is Sierra Actual," the voice said, and Kethra recognized it as Sergeant Chun. "We are moving to reinforce position Keth and maintain fire discipline." There was a pause, and then Chun spoke again in a voice as calm as still water. "We are not losing this moon today." Kethra wanted to respond and tell Chun that the position was lost and that the humans should fall back with everyone else, but before she could speak, the channel filled with other human voices. "Sierra 2 copies and moving to support. Sierra 3 is with you, Sarge. Sierra 4 through 8 are Oscar Mike. 12 humans against a force of hundreds, and they were not retreating." Kithra abandoned the command center and made her way toward position Keth, where her own unit had been stationed before the assault began. What she found there would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The position was a ruin, and collapsed fortifications and burning equipment littered the ground while Dominion forces advanced from 3 directions. A handful of Valoran soldiers huddled behind cover and returned fire sporadically while waiting for death to find them. And through the smoke and fire came the human Skith. Watch them emerge from the chaos, moving with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. They did not run in a panicked sprint, and they did not advance in the careful, measured way of soldiers preserving their energy. They moved like predators who had spotted prey, and every step was deliberate, and every movement flowed into the next. Chun was at the front, and she moved through enemy fire. That should have cut her down instantly, but somehow she twisted and ducked and kept advancing her. Weapon barked again and again, and every shot found a target behind her. The other humans spread out in a formation that covered each approach, and their fire was precise and devastating. The Thra saw a human soldier take a plasma bolt directly to his shoulder, and the impact spun him around and dropped him to one niche. She expected him to stay down, because that wound would incapacitate any Valoran for hours at minimum. Instead, the human looked at his ruined shoulder and made a sound that might have been a curse, and then shifted his weapon to his other hand and kept fighting. His face was twisted in an expression that Kethra had never seen before, and his teeth were bared, but this was not a smile. This was something else entirely, and something that spoke of fury and pain transformed into determination. "Martinez, are you good?" Chun shouted. "Still breathing, Sarge," the wounded human replied, and he rose to his feet and continued forward. Kethra watched in disbelief as the humans pushed the Dominion forces back with nothing but their small weapons and their impossible refusal to fall. She saw a young human woman notice an explosive device land among a group of wounded Alliance soldiers who could not move to escape the blast without hesitation. The young woman threw herself onto the device and covered it with her body. Kethra braced for the detonation that would scatter the human across the frozen ground. But when the blast came, something impossible happened. The human rose from the smoke and blood streamed from dozens of wounds across her body, but she was alive. Armor should not have been sufficient to protect her from that blast, and by every law of physics, Kethra understood she should have been dead. Private Williams. "Report," Chung called out. "Still here, Sarge," the young woman said, and her voice was weak but steady. She bent down and picked up her fallen weapon, and then she kept fighting. Kethra found herself moving forward to join the humans, and she did not remember making the decision to do so. Her body simply moved and her weapon came up, and she was fighting alongside these impossible creatures. The battle for position Keth raged for hours, and during that time, Kethra witnessed things that would change her understanding of warfare forever. She saw humans take wounds that would kill any other species and simply refuse to acknowledge them. She saw them drag wounded comrades to safety under fire that should have cut them all down. She saw them laugh in the face of death and make jokes that she did not understand, but that seemed to fill them with strength. Most of all, she saw them refuse to give up, no matter how bad the situation became. And no matter how many of them fell, the survivors kept fighting with a determination that bordered on madness. As night fell on the first day of the siege, Kethra found herself crouched beside Chun behind a collapsed wall while enemy fire streaked overhead. "How?" Kethra asked, and her voice was raw from shouting. "Orders. How do you keep going?" Chun looked at her with eyes that held no fear, only a calm acceptance that Kethra could not comprehend. "This is what we do, Commander, and this is what we have always done. But you are dying and your people are falling all around you. Then we will make sure their sacrifice means something." Chun rose and moved to another position, and Kethra followed her because she could not bring herself to do anything else. The humans had captured something inside her, and she needed to understand what it was. The battle for Araxis 7 stretched into its second day, and then its third. And by the end of the first day, Kethra had stopped viewing the humans as fragile. By the end of the second day, she had stopped viewing them as sane. She watched them perform acts that defied every survival instinct that evolution had programmed into sentient life over millions of years. A human sniper named Rodriguez took up position in an exposed tower that offered perfect sightlines to the enemy command post, but provided almost no protection from return fire. He stayed in that position for 18 consecutive hours, despite the freezing temperatures that caused his fingers to turn black, and despite the enemy fire that struck all around him every few minutes. His rifle would crack, and somewhere in the distance, a Dominion officer would fall, and the enemy advance would slow just a little bit more when they finally dragged him out of the tower. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite, and his body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. The medic, Torres, worked on him frantically and managed to stabilize him, and when Rodriguez regained consciousness, his first words were a complaint that his rifle scope had cracked from the cold. Not a word about his missing fingers or his near death from exposure, just frustration that his weapon had been damaged, or saw humans carry wounded comrades across open ground while enemy fire tore the air around them and turned the snow red with blood. This made no tactical sense, because the wounded soldiers were no longer combat effective, and the resources spent saving them could have been used to strengthen the defensive line. When she questioned this practice, Torres looked at her with an expression she could not read. "We do not leave our people," he said simply, as if this explained everything. "But the tactical cost," Kethra began. There is no tactical cost that justifies abandoning a fellow soldier, and if we leave one behind, then we have already lost something more important than any battle. Kethra thought about this and realized that she did not fully understand it, but she also realized that she wanted to understand. On the second night of the siege, she found herself assigned to a reconnaissance patrol alongside Chun and 3 other humans. Their mission was to scout the enemy positions and identify weaknesses that could be exploited when the counterattack came. Assuming a counterattack would come at all, they moved through the frozen darkness in silence, and Kethra was surprised at how quiet the humans could be when they chose. She had assumed that their soft bodies would make them clumsy and loud, but they flowed through the terrain like shadows. At one point, they came across a wounded Dominion soldier who had been left behind by his unit and who was slowly freezing to death in the snow. Kethra raised her weapon to end the enemy's suffering quickly, but Chun stopped her. "Let me," Chun said, and she approached the wounded soldier and knelt beside him. Kethra watched in confusion as Chun administered a pain reliever from her medical kit and arranged the soldier's body into a more comfortable position. "He is the enemy," Kethra said. "He is a soldier doing his duty just like us, and he did not choose to be here any more than we did. The pain reliever will ease his passing, and that is something we can offer even to our enemies." Kethra had been fighting wars for longer than this human had been alive, and she had never once considered showing mercy to a fallen enemy. It seemed wasteful and foolish, and yet somehow it also seemed right in a way she could not articulate. They completed their reconnaissance and returned to the defensive line with valuable intelligence about enemy positions. That night, huddled in a bombed-out structure with enemy forces just meters away, Kethra finally asked the question that had been consuming her thoughts since the battle began. "How do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you keep fighting when you know you are going to die?" Chun was quiet for a long moment, and the sounds of distant battle echoed through the ruins. "Can I tell you about my family, Commander?" Kethra nodded, and Chun began to speak. "My grandmother was born in a country that decided her people did not deserve to live, and soldiers came to her village and killed everyone they could find. She was 7 years old, and she hid in a hole in the ground for 3 days while they searched for survivors. When it was finally safe to come out, she walked for 2 weeks through hostile territory until she reached a place where people would help her. She was 7 years old and alone, and she survived." Kethra listened in silence as Chun continued. "My grandfather grew up in a desert where there was never enough water and never enough food, and the sand would bury entire towns if people did not fight to keep it back. When his village well dried up, he walked for 3 days across open desert with no water to reach the next settlement. He almost died twice, but he made it, and he brought back the supplies that saved his family. My mother came to a new country that did not want her and did not speak her language, and did not care if she lived or died. She worked 2 jobs and sometimes 3, and she raised 4 children, and she never once complained because she knew that complaining would not change anything." Chun looked at Kethra with eyes that held the weight of generations. "I come from a species that has been fighting to survive since before we learned to walk upright. The universe has tried to kill us with ice and fire and disease and famine and war, and every time we have refused to die. We do not keep fighting because we think we will win, Commander. We keep fighting because giving up is not something we know how to do." She smiled, and this time Kethra understood the expression. Dying is easy and quitting is easy, and we do not do easy. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. In Kethra's understanding, she understood why the Dominion psychological warfare had failed against the humans. She understood why their tactical models kept predicting human defeats that never came. The humans were not brave, despite their fragility. They were brave because of it. Every moment of courage was a conscious choice made with full knowledge of the cost, and that made it infinitely more meaningful. Kethra looked at this small, soft creature who might not survive to see the sunrise, and she felt something she had never felt for any species in her long life. She felt awe. On the fourth day of the siege, the sky lit up with the arrival of Alliance reinforcements, and Kethra watched from the battered defensive line as fresh ships descended through the clouds. The Dominion forces began to pull back, and their retreat was not orderly or strategic, but rather the desperate flight of an army that had been broken. They had expected to sweep through Araxis 7 in a matter of hours, and instead they had been held for 4 days by a force a fraction of their size. When the shooting finally stopped, Kethra allowed herself to feel something she had not permitted herself to feel since the battle began. Relief. She walked through the ruined positions and counted the cost of the victory, and every number felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Hundreds of Alliance soldiers had died, and dozens more were wounded so badly they would never fight again. But they had held, and the strategic value of Araxis 7 remained in Alliance hands, and the Dominion advance had been stopped. Kethra found the humans gathered near their transport ship, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. Of the 12 humans who had arrived on that battered vessel, only 8 remained standing. 4 had died in the fighting, and their bodies lay wrapped in simple cloth, waiting for transport back to their home world. The survivors were gathered around their fallen comrades, and they were singing it. Was the same haunting melody Kethra had heard on the night before the battle. But now it carried a different weight. The song spoke of loss and memory, and the promise that those who had fallen would not be forgotten. Taurus was there with his arm in a sling and fresh bandages covering wounds that would have killed most species. Williams was there with her body wrapped in so many bandages she looked like she had been assembled from spare parts. Martinez was there with the empty space where his arm used to be before a Dominion blade had taken it from him. And Chun was there with tears streaming down her face as she sang for the friend she had lost. Kethra approached slowly and stood at the edge of the group, not wanting to intrude on their grief. Chun noticed her and gestured for her to come closer. "We are saying goodbye," Chun explained, and her voice was rough with emotion. "Would you like to join us?" Kethra did not know the words to the human song, but she stood with them anyway and let the melody wash over her. When the song ended, Chun wiped her eyes and turned to face Kethra fully. "You saved us," Kethra said. "Your people saved us all, and without your actions on the first day, the entire position would have collapsed." Chun shook her head. "We held the line together, Commander, and that is what allies do. I have fought beside many species in my career, Sergeant. I have never seen anything like what your people did here." Chen's expression softened into something that might have been gratitude or perhaps just exhaustion. "We are not special, Commander, and we are just stubborn." But Kethra knew better now. In the days that followed, she filed her reports and attended briefings with Alliance High Command and participated in countless debriefings where officers demanded to know how the defense of Araxis 7 had succeeded against impossible odds. She struggled to find words that could convey what she had witnessed. How do you explain to someone who was not there that the most fragile species in the Alliance was also the most terrifying? How do you describe a creature that knows it will die and chooses to fight anyway? How do you capture in official military language the horror of watching a being with no natural weapons and no protective armor charge directly into enemy fire because giving up is simply not an option? In her final report, Kethra wrote words that would eventually be circulated throughout the Alliance military and become required reading for any officer assigned to work with human forces. The humans do not fight like soldiers in any way that we understand the term. They fight like something that has already accepted death and chosen to keep walking anyway. They will carry their wounded through fire, even when tactical logic demands they leave them behind. They will hold positions that cannot be held and attack objectives that cannot be taken. They will laugh in the face of annihilation and make jokes that I do not understand, but that seem to give them strength. I have seen true terror in my 300 cycles of military service. It is not the Dominion with their overwhelming numbers and their advanced weapons. It is not the void of space or the silence between stars. True terror is a small, soft-skinned creature with a 70-year lifespan, and no natural defenses, looking at impossible odds and deciding that surrender is not an option. I pity any force in this galaxy that believes humans can be conquered. They do not understand what they are facing. Neither did I until I fought. Beside them, the war would continue for many more cycles, and Kethra would serve alongside humans again on different worlds and in different battles. Each time she witnessed the same impossible resilience and the same terrifying determination. She watched humans drag themselves forward with wounds that should have killed them 3 times over. She watched them mourn their dead and then rise and fight again because stopping was not something they knew how to do. She watched them transform pain and loss and fear into something that looked almost like joy in the heat of battle. Years later, when young Valoran officers were assigned to joint operations with human forces, they would seek out Kethra and ask her what it was like to fight alongside them. She would tell them the truth that she had learned in the blood and fire of Araxis 7. They are the weakest species I have ever encountered, and they are also the strongest. Do not try to understand them because you will fail. Simply be grateful that they are on our side. And in the quiet moments when she was alone, Kethra would think about Sergeant Chun and the others who had stood against the darkness when everyone else had fled. She would remember the song they sang for their fallen, and the tears that ran down their faces and the way they picked up their weapons and kept fighting when the song was done. She would remember the terror she had felt watching them, and she would be grateful for it, because that terror had taught her something that 300 cycles of warfare had never revealed. True courage was not the absence of fear. True courage was knowing exactly what you stood to lose and fighting anyway. The humans had taught her that, and she would carry the lesson for the rest of her very long life. When death finally came for her centuries later, she would face it the way the humans had taught her to face it, not with despair or surrender, but with the same stubborn determination that had held the line on frozen moon against impossible odds. She would face it like a human, and she would not be afraid.